The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Long-storied career studying college and career-ready standards. Andy, to you.
Amy, thank you very much, and welcome everybody. We have a federally funded center the Center for Standards Alignment, Instruction, and Learning, which we call CSAIL. And this is our year 5 conference, completing 5 years of work. And we're going to tell you what we've learned and where we think things might go from here. I want to thank the Institute for Education Sciences for the generous funding that they provided for this work, and to recognize our project officer, James Benson, who will make a few remarks in our 3rd session of this virtual conference later this afternoon today. Next slide. Oh, it's already next slide. Back. Okay. We have partners, institutional partners. The University of Pennsylvania is the lead institution. The American Institutes for Research, the University of Southern California, Vanderbilt, the University of Delaware. We also, although we did this work in all 50 states, focus states, partner states, California, Massachusetts, Ohio, Texas, and we joining us later in our work was the School District of Philadelphia. Now let me just say, we'll start this work in 2015, and where were things in standards-based reform in 2015? Well, 5 years earlier, the Common Core state standards had been published and initially adopted by well over most of the states. The Every Student Succeeds Act, ESA, had just been passed, replacing No Child Left Behind. It was a time of returning leadership in education to the states. After the Common Core standards were adopted by many states, there was a big backlash in many of those states. And at that time, the federal government created 2 multi-state testing consortia. So that's where it was when we started the work. Now, our work has been guided by, next slide, please. Our work has been guided by a policy attributes theory. And basically what this says is that policies like ESA will have greater impact on their desired targets of behavior to the extent that they're specific about what they want, that they're consistent, all of the policies one with another. And then policies can appeal to having authority with people, or they can have power, which means that there are rewards and sanctions associated with compliance. And finally, things are hypothesized to have a bigger effect if they're stable, they last over time. So what we found, just very briefly, is that specificity was greater under ESA than it had been under NCLB. The consistency, the consistency was pretty much stable. At the federal level, they still required state assessments and aligned to their standards. And the other pieces of the puzzle, like curriculum materials and teacher education, were not very much in evidence. The use of rewards and sanctions power was less, and the use of authority was more. And stability was variable across states, with many states having very little stability. They changed their standards and their assessments almost annually during the beginning of our work, but not all of the states. Texas and California, 2 of our partner states, were quite stable. Finally, we had no evidence at the aggregate level for the nation or for the states that student achievement improved under ESA. Now I'll turn it back to Amy.
Thank you, Andy. You can turn off your camera and microphone, and I'll welcome Mung-Lee Song to audio and video. Next slide, please. Mung-Lee is a CSAIL co-director and principal researcher at AIR, specializing in research design, advanced quantitative methods, and evaluations of educational programs and policy. Mung-Lee.
Thanks, Amy. Next slide. Just provide reference for the CSO longitudinal outcome study. So between 2007 and 2015, all states in BC adopted the so-called new college and career-ready standards. And most states adopted the new standards in the form of the Common Core state standards. And over the past few years, there have been a lot of rhetoric, a lot of debate about the new standards, particularly about the Common Core. But there has been very limited empirical research on the impact of new standards on student outcomes. So this study is intended to fill in this gap by assessing the effects of new standards on student achievement as measured by NAEP, and also on high school graduation rate for all students and for key student subgroups. Next slide. This study is based on a comparative interactive time series design, where we compare the change in student outcome trend from before to after the adoption of new standards in a set of treatment states with corresponding change in a set of comparison states. And our classification of the treatment and comparison states was based on the rigor of each state's prior content standards, as measured by two types of indices, the prior rigor index and the prior Common Core similarity index. So basically, we define treatment states as states with less rigorous prior standards, and we define comparison states as states with more rigorous prior standards. And our assumption here is that the new standards represented a stronger form of treatment for states with weaker prior content standards than for states that already have pretty rigorous standards in place before they adopted new standards. And to create a sharper treatment contrast for our analysis, we excluded certain states from our analysis sample. Next slide. Given the timing of the two indices that we use to classify states, and also given that the overwhelming majority of the states adopted new standards in 2010, and our achievement analysis were restricted to states that adopted new standards in 2010. And our high school graduation rate analysis were restricted to states that adopted new standards in 2010 or 2011. And our analytical model is the so-called CITS baseline trend model. To reduce selection bias, we control for a set of time-varying covariates, such as NAEP exclusion rates, and also various state demographics. Next slide. Okay. So this slide shows the NAEP achievement trends from before and after the adoption of new standards in treatment states and in comparison states. And we can see that in each case, the NAEP achievement trends prior to the adoption of the new standards are approximately linear in both treatment and comparison states. And this is reassuring because a linear pre-treatment trend is a critical assumption to ensure the validity of the CITS analysis. Next slide. For state-level high school graduation rate, however, the pre-treatment trend is clearly nonlinear if we look at all years with available data, so as shown in the graph on the left side of the slide. And to address this problem, we decided to restrict the data for high school graduation rate to 2000 and after, so that the pre-treatment trend would be approximately linear, as shown in the graph on the right. Next slide. So now let's look at the results. So this graph shows the effects of the new standards for grade 4 reading. And the black line shows the observed NAEP score, both before and after the adoption of new standards in treatment states. And the red dotted line shows the predicted NAEP scores for the treatment states in the absence of the new standards in the post-treatment time period. So those are the scores that the treatment states would have achieved had they not adopted new standards. So those are the counterfactual. And there were 4 weeks of NAEP data available after adoption of the new standards. They allowed us to assess the effects of new standards 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, and 7 years after adoption. And this graph shows that all these effects are in the negative direction. But these are all small effects, but they are all statistically significant or marginally significant. Next slide. So this figure shows the effects for grade 8 reading. All but the first year effect are negative, but the effects are all very small and non-significant. Next slide. And this shows the results for grade 8 math. With state, oh, hold on a sec. Can you go back one slide? Sorry. Yeah. So this shows results for grade 4 math with state classifications based on the prior rigor index. And we see a similar pattern here. Most of the effects are negative, small and non-significant. Next slide. And this shows results for grade 8 math with state classifications based on the prior rigor index. And the 3-year, 5-year, and 7-year effects are all are all negative, but the effects are generally small. But the 7-year effect does reach statistical significance with an effect size of negative 0.1 standard deviations. And the results for the effects of the new standards on math achievement with the state classifications based on the Common Core Similarity Index are generally similar, and none of those effects are significant. Next slide. This graph illustrates the effects of new standards on high school graduation rate. And the 1-year, 2-year, 3-year effects are all negative, but only the 1-year effect is marginally significant, reflecting a 1.2 percentage point difference between the treatment comparison states. Next one. So in summary, our results are a little disappointing. State adoption of new standards did not lead to improved student achievement or high school graduation rate during the time period we examined. Overall, most of the effects are small and non-significant. Many are in the negative direction, and a few even reach the statistical significance. Next one. So, why are we not seeing the positive effects that we had hoped to see? There are several possible explanations. One is that perhaps the new standards are indeed no better than the old standards, which hopefully is not true. And another potential explanation is that perhaps the new standards are well designed with a great deal of potentials, but they have not yet been well implemented due to various implementation challenges. And here I also wanted to point out that the results that I just presented largely represent the early effects of new standards during the transition time period, because it typically took states 3 to 5 years to fully transition from the old standards to the new standards. So finally, the study has its limitations, so the results need to be interpreted with caution. And that concludes my presentation. I will now turn it back to Aiden.
Thank you so much, Mengli. You can turn off your camera and microphone, and I'm going to welcome Morgan and Adam to both audio and video. Morgan Polikoff is a CSAIL co-director and an associate professor of education at the University of Southern California, Rossier School of Education, specializing in design, implementation, and effects of standards, assessment, and accountability policies. So Morgan will be co-facilitating this opening session with me by leading discussions with leading experts to put CSAIL's findings in broader context. So I'm going to turn now to Morgan to introduce our first guest.
Thank you very much, Amy. I'm delighted to introduce Adam Gamron. He's president of the William T. Grant Foundation, where he's launched initiatives aimed at reducing inequality in youth outcomes. Prior to joining WT Grant, Adam was the John D. MacArthur Chair in Sociology and Educational Policy Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Adam, thanks very much for joining.
My pleasure.
So let's talk about these results. Whether you're using sophisticated methods or whether you're just sort of eyeballing NAEP trends, it's clear that whatever achievement growth that we were seeing 10 or 20 years ago just isn't there anymore. Do you think there's hope for standards to continue to have positive effects on student achievement? And if so, what needs to happen for continued improvement?
Well, I think that's the right question to be asking, Morgan, in light of these findings. And I think we need to put it in context by understanding that the challenge for U.S. education is not the lack of achievement growth, it's the inequality in student trajectories. And it remains to be seen the extent to which the standards are having effects on inequality. With that said, I don't think there's much reason to expect the results to be very different for the subgroups once those are presented. And I think there are some reasons that we've seen limited benefits from the imposition of standards through the state adoptions of the Common Core State Standards through this period. First of all, the political context of the adoption of standards was not a smooth one. It was fraught, and there has been resistance. And so we need to think about standards adoption in a challenging context. But second of all, standards are merely a tool, and they need to be supported. They need to be implemented in a context with adequate materials, where the curriculum is aligned with the standards, with assessments that are designed to pick up the content that's introduced through the standards. And it's not clear that NAEP is the right assessment for that. More importantly, teachers need to be prepared to use new standards and to buy into those standards. And we need to introduce standards in a context with rich support systems for struggling students who need more than the hour a day of instruction in their 8th grade math class in order to succeed.
Well, I'm writing a book about the struggles of the standards movement, and I might just quote that. So I hope that we have a nice recording of that response. So what other outcomes, you questioned NAEP, and I agree with you. I'm not sure that NAEP is necessarily the right outcome that we should be looking at here, but what other outcomes should we be looking at to fully capture the potential impacts of the standards? Or is it not really a question of whether they're working, but more a question of where they're working well and not working well?
Well, I think those are both important points. And as we start to think about other outcomes, we need to think about additional conditions that are necessary for standards to have any benefit. So I've talked about conditions that help teachers implement standards well, but there are conditions outside the classroom that are necessary. For example, time for teachers to collaborate with one another. Time is the teacher's most precious resource, and it is allocated in a scarce way in our schools. And if teachers had more time to collaborate, they could work together more effectively on implementing standards. And we also need to see leadership focused on instruction, good discipline and order, a frequent monitoring of student progress, all the elements that are necessary for effective teaching and learning in any school. And finally, this is about conditions outside of schools. There's no more important issue to think of now in our current reality than nutrition, safety, trauma. Standards are one small tool in this larger context. So as we think about other outcomes, we can think about students' ability to work in teams, students' ability to achieve cultural competency as well as cognitive performance, students' ability to use new tools such as the technology tools that are so widespread, and thinking about where and who as much as how much as we see the dramatic inequalities being exacerbated by the pandemic that we're all facing.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, right now, we're holding this conference virtually because of the pandemic, and we're all thinking about what's going on around the country and around the world. And I'm wondering, how does the COVID crisis intersect with the standards movement? And to what extent are standards appropriate in this time, or does COVID make you rethink standards in any way? What role should standards be playing right now?
I don't think the pandemic makes me rethink standards, but it does put it in perspective. Because in a time where students are struggling to find food, to have safe places to live, secure environments, technology to keep up with their studies, at a time when students are isolated from their peers, at a time when teachers are struggling to reach their students, to fulfill their duties as teachers, often with important demands in the home, competing for their time. we can see that, yes, we need standards. We need to identify what students need to learn and be able to do. But that won't get us very far if we can't meet students' basic needs, if we can't provide them with nutrition and safety and the human interaction that they need to function as young adults.
All right. Well, thank you for that interesting discussion. And I am now going to pass it back to Amy.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Warren. And good work to the center and the great information that you provided us.
Thank you so much, Adam. So I'm going to invite our implementation team onto camera now to present their findings. So we'll look at the next slide. We're joined by Nelson Flores, Associate Professor of Education at the University of Pennsylvania and leading expert in bilingual education, policy, and practice. We will also hear from Lynn and Doug Fuchs, Professors of Education at Vanderbilt University and leading experts in special education and standards assessment and instructional practice. But to begin the presentation of the implementation team findings, I first introduce Laura Desmond, CSAIL co-director and professor of education and director of research at the University of Delaware, who specializes in how state, district, and school level policy can improve teaching and learning and the role of teachers' professional learning in that endeavor. So to you, Laura.
Thank you, Amy. I'm Laura Desmond, co-director at the center, and I'm going to share some of the key findings from our implementation line of work. Next slide. I first want to acknowledge and thank the wonderful team of graduate students and researchers who've worked on this project over the past 5 years. Next slide. The research questions that the implementation stream focused on were examining the policy environment according to the policy attributes for people at different levels of the system, the nature and quality of supports and guidance that educators were receiving, and finally looking at alignment to standards and how that differed for teachers in elementary school, high school, teachers of math and English language arts, and English learners and students with disabilities. Next slide. Our framework was to look at the relationship between the policy attributes and aligned instruction with the idea that this would be moderated by resources, professional learning, and challenges. Next slide. The data that we used to study implementation were state representative surveys in our partner states. And in Ohio and Texas, we had data from both 2016 and most recently 2019 and 20. We conducted interviews with state and district administrators every year of the study, and we did a series of deep dive case studies in our partner states to observe teachers and talk with them and their principals and district administrators. Next slide. So one key finding was that there were moderately high levels of the policy attributes across actors and different levels of the system. Notable here are that principals and superintendents had significantly higher buy-in than did teachers. And from 2016 to 2020, some respondents reported stronger policy environments related to the standards, more authority, consistency, and power. Next slide. In terms of teachers, one of the key findings was that teachers of students with disabilities were significantly lower in the reported authority for the standards, but teachers of math, ELA, and ELs had similarly moderate levels of authority. So they believed in the standards. They thought they were good for students. Next, and there was no change in this pattern from 2016 to 2020. Next slide. In terms of the top 5 resources that teachers said they wanted to support their aligned instruction, they wanted aligned curricula, digital tools, professional learning, assessments, information about instructional change. What's notable here are 2 things. One, that teachers in both Ohio and Texas reported these same 5 resources. And second, that wanting these resources didn't change from 2016 to 2020. Teachers still want these resources to support their instruction. Next slide. In terms of challenges, the top 5 challenges teachers named were mostly related to students, their ability, their preparation, their absenteeism, support from parents. The one infrastructure item was insufficient class time. As Adam said, time is very precious. Again, notable here, teachers in Ohio and Texas, very similar responses across states and no change in pattern over time. So these challenges are still being felt by teachers. Next slide, please. In terms of aligned instruction, we found wide variation in the extent to which teachers' instruction was aligned to standards. One key finding was that elementary math teachers had the strongest alignment to standards, and they increased in alignment from 2016 to 2020. Next slide, please. What predicts aligned instruction? We found that variation in alignment was related to having access to specific and aligned curricula, support from effective, high-quality professional learning, and being in an environment with stable standards and assessments. Next slide. We also found that there was some tension between teachers wanting specificity and guidance and district and states being hesitant to provide it so as not to infringe on local control. Next slide. We found that there was a shift from hard power, the perceived punitive sanctions associated with NCLB, to something we call smart power, which is more of a focus on rewards and supports. Next slide. And finally, we note that given all of our data collections, we found that professional learning and adaptive leadership played a key role in building authority, specificity, and consistency in supporting standards implementation. I will now turn the virtual podium over to my colleague, Nelson Flores.
Thank you so much, Laura. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about our findings that are focused specifically on English learners. Next slide. So just to give you a sense of our different partner states, you can see that California and Texas are states that have large numbers of English learners, and that's been a long-standing population. Massachusetts being kind of a middle range state that has a growing EL population, and Kentucky and Ohio both having relatively small populations historically of English learners. But as you can see between 2003 and 2013, that number has doubled and has continued to increase. And you can also see that California and Texas as states that have long histories of supporting English learners are not part of either of the national consortia, whereas Kentucky, Massachusetts, and Ohio are part of two different consortia, Kentucky and Massachusetts being part of WIDA, and Ohio being part of ELSA 21. Next slide. I'm just going to briefly go over some of the survey data that was focused specifically on English learners. We were able to collect survey data from Kentucky, Ohio, and Texas in 2016, and California, Ohio, and Texas in 2020. And so unsurprisingly, Texas teachers reported feeling significantly more prepared to teach English learners than teachers in Ohio and Kentucky. In 2020, Ohio teachers continued to report feeling significantly less prepared to teach ELs than teachers in California or Texas, with Ohio having not improved. Texas teachers reported receiving significantly more PD than Ohio and Kentucky for English learners in 2016, and that has remained the case for California and Texas reporting significantly higher PD than Ohio. But finally, in 2016, EL teachers reported, so teachers who were specifically designated as EL teachers, reported providing comparable grade level instruction to mainstream teachers in Texas and Ohio. There were too few respondents in Kentucky to be able to make any claims about that. And that remains the case, where EL teachers in 2020 in California, Ohio, and Texas still report providing comparable grade level instruction to mainstream teachers in California, Ohio, and Texas. With consistency, authority, and power having significantly increased for EL teachers in Ohio and Texas, suggesting that the policy environment has gotten stronger for these teachers in the past 4 years. Next slide. This is all happening within the context of an increasing specificity of EL policy in each of the states that we worked with. So state leaders reported taking the lead in developing more specific policies. In states that are part of consortia, they specifically highlighted the collaboration with the two national consortia and really supporting their work at developing more specific policies to support English learners. And so what's interesting is whereas the general accountability assessment systems, PARC and Smarter Balance, have received a lot of pushback and resistance, most states are using one of two assessment systems for identifying, monitoring, and reclassifying ELs, and that has been relatively uncontroversial. In fact, the increasing specificity of these policies has been welcomed rather than seen as a threat to local control because of its connection to authority as opposed to power. Next slide. our deep dive data suggested a range of different types of districts in working with English learners. Oftentimes people think about things in terms of urban, suburban, or rural, and what we found is that actually wasn't the most meaningful distinction. There were a lot of contextual factors such as density, demographics, and history that played a significant role in the capacity of states and districts to support English learners. So this is kind of the beginnings of a typology, thinking about high numbers versus low numbers, and homogeneous versus heterogeneous populations, and the ways that these contextual factors are really important in understanding the capacities that districts and states have in supporting English learners, the type of programming that's possible in those districts, and how we can begin to think about differentiating the types of supports that states and national consortia are providing to districts and schools based on these types. Next slide. Finally, some of the implications of this are that simply covering grade level standards may not be sufficient as increasing EL achievement data as seen in Meng Li's study on the longitudinal study, and that creating a state level system of differentiated support for districts based on the typology proposed may be a way of supporting districts in raising EL academic achievement. And I could imagine the national consortia playing a role in helping to develop this differentiated structure. Finally, creating a research agenda to identify other contextual information that should be considered in conceptualizing this differentiated support can help create a more robust system of differentiation. So with that said, I'm going to pass the mic over to Dr. Lynn Fuchs, who's going to talk about students with disabilities.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk about three major conclusions related to the standards and students with disabilities. I'm going to summarize these conclusions briefly, and Doug will be elaborating on them in the breakout session on students with disabilities, which will also be the main moderator. So three conclusions. Next slide, please. We derive these data from both the longitudinal study, which Meng Li talked about, and from the implementation study, which Laura explained and described, which Nelson was talking about. Next slide. So our first conclusion is that the NAEP analysis provides little basis for thinking that academic standards reform boosts the reading or math performance of students with disabilities. And in the breakout, Doug will show you some actual data, some results from that. The second conclusion comes from the interview and survey data, which suggests that the lack of effects that we see on achievement may be exacerbated by a lack of buy-in about the idea of universal applicability of standards, and by a need for more knowledge about appropriate instructional practices that support students with disabilities and their teachers. For example, state officials believe that the standards are appropriate for students with disabilities, whereas local administrators and building personnel, as Laura mentioned, express skepticism. And the degree of skepticism increases with the proximity of personnel, with the familiarity of personnel with students with disabilities. Another example is state officials report messaging an increased accountability focus for students with disabilities, but district leaders say this isn't trickling down to schools and teachers don't remember receiving that messaging. Additionally, state administrators report professional development initiatives involving universal design, accommodations, and differentiation. But here again, teachers don't recall these forms of professional development, and they express the need for more recommendations for supplemental materials that address the needs of students with disabilities. And they report a lack of specific policies and programs to support students with disabilities achieving the standards. Next slide. Go back to the preceding slide. And the third bullet on this slide refers to some interview data in one of the more recent waves of data collection that begin to reveal some encouraging initiatives at the state and district levels that actually support coordination, better coordination between general and special education teachers to address the needs of students with disabilities. And I'll just mention 3 examples. In Pennsylvania, general and special education teacher teams attend professional development sessions together. A Texas district holds weekly curriculum meetings that include special educators. And Ohio state support teams work with schools to remove barriers to students with disabilities from meeting the standards. So we'll talk more about these issues in the breakout. And right now, I'll turn back to Amy.
Thank you so much, Lynn, Doug, Laura, and Nelson. I'm going to ask you now to turn off your cameras and mute yourselves, and we'll invite Morgan, Brent, Kat, and Renee to all come to camera and unmute yourselves. I'm going to welcome Morgan Polikoff to introduce our panelists and discuss with them the implementation team findings. Morgan?
Thank you very much. So I'm going to introduce our panel here. Brent Malicote is Assistant Superintendent of Educational Services at the Sacramento County Office of Education, where he oversees early learning, foster youth services, K-12 curriculum and instruction, prevention and early intervention, and special education. Renee Bradley from the U.S. Office of Special Education Programs Research to Practice Division. Renee has a 23-year history at the department, including leading the LD Initiative, the National Research Center on Learning Disabilities, and currently the National Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. And Kat Still is Executive Director of ELPA 21, an English language proficiency assessment system supported by member states and housed at CREST. Kat, prior to joining the team at CREST, Kat worked as a program director for ELPA 21 at the Council of Chief State School Officers. So welcome to all 3 of you. So Brent, we have been doing standards now for more than 20 years. What would you say that we have learned about the do's and don'ts? And what do you think of the potential of standards-based reform to improve instruction and learning in the context of the structure of our educational systems?
Yeah, well, good morning, everyone, and thanks, Morgan, and it's really a pleasure to be here. So I think I would lead with some of the do's that I've learned. I've been a classroom teacher, I've been a school principal, I've been a charter school director, I've worked at the California Department of Ed, and now I work at a county office of education. And some of the do's, probably the most important, is that we really think about sustained time when we're thinking about the professional development that's required to do standards implementation well. And along with that, that sustainability requires, and Adam was talking about this earlier too, the idea of really systematic collaboration, both across systems and within systems. So that kind of opportunity for intra-collaboration at school sites, within districts, but then also learning from others across districts. And I do think, you know, there's clearly no silver bullet on this in terms of doing standards implementation well. But if there's one thing that's been a common denominator when I've seen success happening around successful standards implementation, it is that element of collaboration. I think it's interesting. You know, everybody claims they've got a professional learning community, and now we start to see a shift where we've got all kinds of new names for professional learning communities. I was thinking about this morning. We call them huddles now. We call them professional learning networks now. We call them communities of practice. There's all these different names, and I don't get caught up so much in the name or the intricacies that go with each of those different kinds of collaboration, but it's that idea of systematic collaboration, both within a system and across a system, which is that common denominator that I continue to see when standards implementation is going well. And I would point out just quickly too that we need to really think about our school leaders in all of this, principals, vice principals, teachers that are on leadership teams, all of those folks need to really be front and center in this. If we want to position our principals and other school leaders as instructional leaders, we've really got to support them with the right kinds of professional development and the opportunities for them to be able to collaborate.
Thank you. And I should say to all the panelists, feel free to pop in. I'm also going to direct questions to you, but feel free to pop in if you want to respond to anything you've heard. So Renee, you know, we heard, I would say, some maybe discouraging findings from Lynn and Doug Fuchs. So how might schools address the tensions between these ambitious career and college-ready standards and the individualized needs of students with disabilities in order to actually enhance outcomes for these students?
Morgan, thanks for giving me an uncomplicated question to address in a really short time period. I'll try, and we'll do a lot more.
You have 2 minutes to solve special education.
There is definitely a tension. That I wonder how much of that tension is a remnant of our history that we've yet to let go of. It's not just for students with disabilities that this tension may exist, but it's for many children that are failing to make expected progress. So your question asked about suggestions on how to address. So I'm going to throw out 4 possibilities. Number one, I would say that we need to be careful not to let the tensions or the level of difficulty serve as an excuse for inaction or failure to apply these standards to students with disabilities. For students with disabilities, in almost the 45-year history of the predecessor to IDEA was passed, these students have defied time and time again the common misperception of their limited performance or achievement. And we now have numerous examples of college and career ready standards coexisting quite well with individualization. Secondly, I would posit that instruction should be organized in a systemic, tiered system of support for all children. MTSS by design promotes individualization for all, and it's based on their needs, not a label, not gender, not geography. This universal tier 1 instruction can provide the foundation for us to be able to align grade level instruction and standards for all children, not just children with disabilities. And then additional tiers provide the framework for more levels of individualization. Not only the instructional content, but most important, the instructional delivery, the strategies and supports that are needed to ensure access and progress. Third, the professional development and ongoing coaching support that's already been addressed on effective instruction. We say it's critical, but rarely is sufficient time provided. And our strongest efforts need to be directed towards the leverage points that we know make the biggest difference. And lastly, I would say that we continue to need to work on our policy practice outcome loop. And that's yet to be conquered by, like many policies, the intent may be appropriate and aspirational, but we continue to stumble on the implementation. Standards or testing doesn't close gaps. Good instruction is what closes gaps. And to address that, we have to invest in our teachers and how they deliver that instruction and individualize that instruction for those that need more.
Great. Thank you very much. Kat, what are some of the challenges that states and districts have encountered in preparing English learners to meet the demands of college and career ready standards, and how has ALPA 21 supported its partner states in meeting these challenges?
I'm glad you asked about this, Morgan. There are numerous challenges in supporting English learners, but English learners are a growing and diverse subgroup, and their presence in our classroom offers tremendous potential and opportunities. Balancing needs here is, of course, challenging, but it's critical that both EL specialists and general education teachers implement English language proficiency standards. This supports English learners and their growing mastery of both the English language and the academic language of the content area instruction. So that is one of the big challenges that we see. And this kind of ties back to Brent's theme about collaboration. The more we can collaborate across these areas, we better support these English learners. So for example, when planning instruction that engages English learners, it's important that both content area classroom teachers and language specialists can work together to ensure that English learners are afforded comprehensible standards-based instruction to provide equitable access to the content while they're progressing toward full proficiency in English. In terms of how we meet the challenges, The ALPA 21 system was built from the ground up to meet these challenges and support the new and rigorous standards that emerged from the college and career ready movement. Our ELP standards carry embedded linkages to the language skills, knowledge, and abilities required to participate in grade level academic work and discourse. So by lining up these new college and career ready standards from the start, ALPA 21 was poised to meet these challenges. We supported and continue to support our partner states by being true partners. Our states wanted ELP standards that reflect current research and understanding of how the brain learns and uses language and how language is developed in academic and social settings. They wanted standards to be informed by educators who know English learners and not just by researchers, and wanted to avoid the prescriptive nature of prior standards. So our standards are state-led and research-informed, and were created by practitioners who know English learners. Thus, they meet the needs of agencies, EL programs, and classroom educators.
All right, thank you very much to all three of you. It was a brief discussion, hopefully just the start, and I'm going to pass it now back to Amy.
Thank you so much, Morgan, Brent, Kat, and Renee. I know we'll look forward to more discussions about these topics in the breakout sessions. You can all turn off your cameras and mute yourselves now, and I'm going to welcome Tony to turn on audio and video. Tony Smith is a principal researcher at AIR and a member of the CSAIL research team, specializing in teacher professional learning and math education. Tony.
Thank you, Amy. The Feedback on Alignment and Support for Teachers, or FAST study, is a randomized controlled trial test of the impact of a virtual coaching program on teachers' instruction and their students' achievement. I co-led this study along with my colleague, Mike Garrett, who's a vice president at AIR and is also a co-director of CSAIL. In this presentation, I'll provide an overview of the FAST program, describe the design of the experimental study, and then share some preliminary results from that study. Next. The FAST program is intended to support teachers in better understanding their state standards and implementing instruction aligned to those standards. It focuses on 4th grade math and 5th grade ELA. Next. The program includes 3 components, and these are all described in detail in that conference handout that you see in your GoToMeeting control panel, but I'll just give a brief overview here. The first component is personalized coaching. Teachers meet with a FAST coach who's an expert in math or ELA individually and as part of collaborative teams to discuss the content of their instruction and identify ways to strengthen the alignment of their instruction to their state standards. And these meetings occur virtually using video conferencing technology. The second component is a pair of tools to support alignment on reflection. Teachers use instructional logs in which they document the content they taught, as well as lesson video recordings to analyze their teaching with their instructional coaches during the individual coaching sessions. And finally, the FAST program offers an online library of resources. This library includes resources to help teachers and lesson activities that they can use in their teaching. After the individual coaching sessions, FAST coaches recommend resources from this library that teachers can draw upon as they enact the next steps that they identified in their meetings together. Next. Our experimental study of the FAST program was designed to answer 3 research questions. How is it implemented? Does it lead to greater alignment of teachers' instruction with state standards? And does it lead to stronger student achievement? Next. We conducted the study in 5 districts located in 3 states. Across the 5 districts, we recruited 56 schools to participate. Compared with the national population of public schools serving students in the study's target grades of 4 and 5, the schools in this study tended to be larger, they were more concentrated in urban areas, and they served higher percentages of minority and disadvantaged students. Within each district, we randomly assigned half of the study schools to either the treatment condition or the control condition. And 2 of our 5 districts had an odd number of schools, and so in those districts, we assigned more to treatment than control, giving us a total of 29 schools in the treatment condition and 27 schools in the control condition in our study overall. Next. We implemented the FAST program in the treatment schools during the 2017-18 and 2018-19 school years. We intended for teachers to complete 5 team meetings, 5 individual coaching sessions, 5 videos, and 5 logs in each of the 2 years. To address our first research question regarding implementation of the program, we collected program artifacts like teacher attendance sheets or coach logs documenting activity in the coaching sessions, throughout implementation. To address our second research question regarding the impact of the FAST program on the alignment of teachers' instruction to state standards, we asked treatment and control teachers to complete a survey of enacted curriculum, or SEC, prior to the start of any FAST activity, so that would be at baseline, and then again at the end of each study year. When they complete the SEC, teachers are asked to report on the level of emphasis that they gave to math or ELA topics at various levels of cognitive demand during the school year. This information is then used to analyze the alignment of their instruction to their state standards. Finally, we use student scores on state tests to examine the impact of the program on student achievement, which was our third research question. These data were collected at the end of each study year. So let's look at what we found in our preliminary analyses of the data after 2 years. Next. We focused our analyses on the regular 4th grade math and 5th grade ELA classroom teachers who were in those study schools in the spring of the second year and their students. Our analyses impact on instruction included the teachers from that group who had provided SEC data at the end of the second year, as well as the study schools that had at least one teacher with that data. For math, the instructional impact sample included 85% of the study schools and 76% of the study teachers. For ELA, it included 81% of the study schools and 66% of the study teachers. Our analyses of the impact on student achievement then included the study students for whom we had spring 2019 state test scores, the teachers in whose classes those students were enrolled, as well as those students' schools. In both subjects, almost all students had achievement data, and so almost all study schools, teachers, and students were included in the analysis. Next. Although the FAST program was made available to all treatment teachers in the target grades, they didn't all participate. In some cases, principals declined participation for the whole school after random assignment to competing initiatives at the time. In other cases, principals didn't decline, but none of the teachers agreed to participate. It's important to note, however, that over half of the treatment teachers that were included in that instructional impact sample that I just described did participate in at least one FAST activity across the 2 years, and so were exposed to treatment. Overall, teachers who participated in FAST completed approximately 16 meetings, 5 coach sessions, 5 videos, and 5 blogs on average. Participation was a bit higher in math than ELA, but overall, they participated in about half of the total number of sessions that we had initially planned for. And this was due in part to a delayed start in the first year of the study, as it took us a little bit longer than anticipated to collect that baseline SEC data, which then delayed the startup of the actual FAST activities. The teachers who did participate reported finding the activities to be valuable for reflecting on and improving their instruction. Next. Despite lower participation in FAST activities than expected, preliminary analyses suggest that the FAST program had a statistically significant positive impact on the alignment of teachers' instruction to state standards in math. In ELA, the preliminary analyses suggest that the FAST program had a positive but not statistically significant impact on instruction at the end of the second year. In both subjects, however, the effects appear to be larger in year 2 than they were in year 1. Analyses of the impact on student achievement are ongoing for year 2, but we didn't find a significant effect in year 1. Next. So what may explain these results for our study? One explanation may be that the treatment teachers in our study didn't complete the full set of intended FAST activities, so they didn't get the full dosage of treatment. Another explanation may be the relationship between alignment and achievement in our data. We had anticipated that teachers whose instruction is better aligned would have students who make better gains, but that wasn't true in our year 1 data. Analyses of year 2 are ongoing, so we'll be interested to see what those data show. And finally, a third explanation could be that the state tests, which we use to measure student achievement, are not well aligned to the standards, but we would need to do more exploration to see if that was the case. In terms of next steps, we continue to analyze our year 2 data and plan to have those analyses completed in the upcoming year. Thank you, and I'll now turn it back to Amy.
Thank you so much, Tony. You can leave camera and mute yourself, and I will invite Morgan, Sarah, and Kristala to turn on your cameras and audio. Morgan Polikoff is coming back here to discuss the FAST findings now and introduce our panelists to help put those in context. Morgan?
Thank you very much. All right, I'm happy to introduce Sarah Wolfen, who's an associate professor at the University of Connecticut MEAG School of Education's Department of Educational Leadership. Sarah studies the relationship between education policy and equitable instruction and co-edits educational researcher. And Dr. Kristala Musa is Distinguished Professor of Teacher Education and Director of the School of Education at the University of Delaware. She has expertise in the learning sciences, including teacher learning, applications of technology in K-12 classrooms, and teaching and learning outcomes in ubiquitous and mobile computing environments. So, Sarah, the FAST intervention results that we just heard about suggest that we can move the needle on instruction in desired ways, but that this progress is spotty and uneven. For instance, we saw bigger changes in math than in English language arts. What are you seeing out there in terms of ways to consistently improve instruction and drive alignment that work at scale? And what about ways to effectively differentiate instruction for English learners and students with disabilities?
So to answer the question about sustainable and consistent improvement in instruction, I actually want to kind of draw back on and kind of amplify points that Dr. Flores and Brent Malikote made. So in terms of from Dr. Flores' point, he sort of brought up this idea of sort of systems of support for districts, and Brent mentioned this notion of sort of partnering across levels. And so I think that one emerging and promising practice is this idea of partnering across levels to better link policy and practice, and the partnering being a really active form of collaboration between researchers, university instructors in educator programs, district leaders, school leaders that would include both principals and coaches, as well as teachers. And I think that in those sort of partnering spaces and partnering practices, there are ways to develop capacity, there are ways to think through what are the enabling and constraining conditions in different contexts that are shaping instruction, that are shaping some of these stubborn patterns in sort of teachers' work that then lead to these sort of stubborn gaps amongst different types of students in these various. So I want to sort of mention kind of this partnership approach as perhaps one strategy to sustainably and consistently improve instruction. To your second question with regard to sort of promising practices related to English learners and also for students with disabilities, I think that, again, thinking through what is sort of, how do we make these messages more consistent? How do we not think about serving English learners or serving students with disabilities as sort of the one more thing, or as a place or as a responsibility of someone else, but how do we make this a consistent, coherent part of the work that we do in instructional improvement? So again, I think that there are ways to bring in principals in this. I think that there are ways to make sure that the coaching is fully aligned across these for these various students and subgroups, and to sort of improve instruction for all through that.
Just to follow up briefly on the first question, I'm wondering if you have, are there some examples of sites or places where you think that this has seen this, these kinds of collaborations across levels highlighted?
Mm-hmm. So I think one long-term project was the MIST project related to improving math instruction at Vanderbilt. Jen Russell also has a partnership approach in looking at math coaching in Tennessee. So those are sort of two that I'm thinking of right now.
Okay, thank you. So Kristala, we're in a new online world now. Who knows how long it's going to last, but clearly there are going to be ripple effects for years. So what do the FAST intervention results tell you about the promise and the challenges of online teacher support and coaching?
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Thanks for having me, and thank you for the question, which is very timely, as you might imagine. So certainly the shift to remote teaching made it very clear that we need to be working on new models of teacher professional development and support. although there's a rich body of literature on online professional development, I would say that its potential to support teacher learning, it's still a little bit under investigated. So we do need more rigorous studies such as the FAST study that look at the role of virtual coaching, for example, in being able to facilitate, that teacher learning and really identifying strengths and weaknesses. So we do know that online professional development could be effective, and it could provide the time base for both synchronous and asynchronous interactions. It could also offer opportunities for teachers to reflect on issues of practice, either individually or in collaboration with colleagues. And coupled with this idea of virtual coaching, which I think is gaining a lot of momentum, similar to what was offered in the FAST study, I think online professional development could really provide a more customized type of learning experience that could directly support teachers' pedagogical practice. I would say the use of video in particular can help teachers learn how to notice and assess their practice. And again, there's plenty of literature in support of that. Much of it has been done in face-to-face sessions. So I would say one of the biggest challenges we have as we think about online approaches is thinking about what has been done in face-to-face session and how can be translated into online environments, and how can be translated in ways that could also be able to scale and sustain the end of the intervention. For example, some of the new approaches to online professional development would allow for more personalized feedback, but also opportunities for peers to provide feedback. So for example, new tools would allow teachers to annotate video together. So instead of having this one directional approach where the coach just provides input or feedback to the teacher, you have teachers working together, examining records of practice. So in terms of challenges, though, as you might imagine, this doesn't come easy. And I think we have all seen it through the pandemic, how challenging it was for teachers across the board, including teacher educators. So there has been, a long stream of literature really encouraging teacher education programs to include some of those approaches in their preparation programs, which I think we should take a little bit more seriously. So I would say, there are definitely constraints when we think about, this type of online approaches. One being time. I think Adam really said it very nicely in the introductory remarks, that time is really the most precious resource for teachers. So thinking about how we can structure online activities in the context of teachers' day, it's very important. Sometimes there's this misguided belief that if it's online, it's easier, or because it could be done anytime, any place, that teachers should be doing it outside of school time. And I think, that's one issue that we need to be careful. I would say the other issue is that technology, and again, that came very clearly through the pandemic, the teachers' expertise. So as much as possible, if we can leverage tools that schools are already using and teachers are already using, we're more likely to see sustainability of those efforts. Technology changes very rapidly, so asking teachers to master new tools all the time, could be really very time consuming and could really turn them off. So the last thing I would say, is a lot of times we think about online as just simply doing activities that, put teachers in front of screens. And I would say the value of the FAST study and the way we've approached it is this combination of digital and non-digital activities, so that teachers have the opportunity to take their classroom, but meet with a virtual coach. So as much as we can think about opportunities in which we can combine the virtual, the digital with the any experiences that are anchored directly in teachers' classrooms, I would say, that would be beneficial.
All right. Well, thank you for that question. For that answer, your answer makes me think that I think it would be really valuable that there, or maybe it already exists, for there to be some guidance for districts that are making decisions right now about teacher learning in the coming year. What, I can say as someone who just recently has had to move to online instruction, I feel like my university has actually done a very good job of giving us the resources that we need and the supports that we need to learn about how to do that, because lots of us have no experience in that form. So that could be a really valuable resource. So thank you both for your comments, and I will give it back to Amy.
Thank you, Morgan. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Christella. Morgan, you can stay on, and Sarah and Christella can move off camera. And now we can invite Jeff to jump on video and audio as we transition to our final discussion of the session. So Morgan, you can introduce our next guest, and I'll pop off.
All right, thank you. Jeff Pelzel is the superintendent of the Newhall School District in California, up the road from me. Prior to his appointment there, he had served as assistant superintendent of instruction, a school leader, a mathematics and a psychology teacher in both California and Washington State. So, Jeff, so in terms of standards implementation, what do you think that district leaders need most from their state departments of education or other state-run agencies like, for instance, counties in California? And how could the state support the district better? Oh, you're muted. We are still muted. Our first technical difficulty.
Yes, can one of the organizers jump?
I'm good now. I'm good. Yeah, someone unmuted me. It was controlled. So, in terms of when I think about the, state supporting school districts and those kind of things, obviously the biggest part is the funding structures that are in place to be able to put systems and structures. What I've loved so far this morning and what I've heard, and I think about the work that we're doing in the Newhall School District, it really is about ongoing systemic approach to the work that we're doing. It can't be this is our fad this year, this is what we're taking on this year, and then we're moving on to something new the following year. And so you have to have that consistent ongoing structure and support. And I also do think accountability is important in this. When I think about you want to support English learners, you want to support students with disabilities, it's really disaggregating the data and looking at student group outcomes overall. And that accountability structure is a benefit for school districts, whether we like it or not, and the outcomes that we may be getting may be rough. But I do think that accountability does drive us to improve what we're doing each and every day across the district.
So when you look at peer districts that are also really succeeding, what do you think are some of the common threads you observe, and what about the flip side? What about districts that are struggling? What are they missing? You've already talked about collaboration, so we don't need to beat the collaboration horse to death, but are there other things that you think are really important, maybe that you haven't heard about in the comments so far?
Well, it was mentioned about the aligned curriculum, and I think school districts that are accelerating really take time when they make a decision around the curriculum they're going to choose to adopt. They go through a really vetted process that involves stakeholders from across your district or across their entire district, and really take time to think through that important decision. Because when you're adopting curriculum, you're going to sit with that for 5 to 7, maybe 10 years, depending upon the funding source. So it's easy to get caught up in bells and whistles and things looking good, but from a packaging perspective, but you really have to get in to have your teachers look at that curriculum and understand the standards that are, that we're expected to teach, and does that curriculum align to, what we're being asked to do?
So the curriculum issue, I think, is a great one, and I think something that Newhall seems to have had a really coherent approach to. I was wondering if you could maybe just talk we believe it or not, we're actually ahead of schedule, so we have a few extra minutes. I was wondering if you could just talk for a minute or two about Newhall's approach to curriculum, and sort of what you've learned over the last few years as you've been implementing these new core curriculum programs in your district.
So, I'll speak in particular around math, because I think that's one of the things that we're really proud of is our efforts around mathematics instruction. And, we began 5 years ago on this journey as we were transitioning to Common Core standards and those kind of things in our district. We really grounded ourselves in the standards before we ever really looked at the resources that were out there. We wanted our teachers to unwrap those standards We brought in a professional expert, a consultant that worked with our teachers 4 years. We spent 4 years having ongoing professional development. 3-4 times a year, classroom teachers pulled out at a grade level, working with this expert, really deepening their knowledge around what are those effective practices, really looking at the mathematical practices, not just the standards, to shift our classroom instruction from to more of a teacher, a facilitator of learning and those kind of things. And then we went about looking at the curriculum that was going to match our approach to teaching that we knew would move kids along in the academic progress. And so that's when I talk about that, not a drive-by. It really took an ongoing effort over those 4 years. And now, and also the other part that really resonated with me in that last conversation was we hired in our onset of this work, we hired 4 instructional math coaches in our district. And we're 10 schools, but we had 4 instructional math coaches who really focused in primary and upper grade and worked with classroom teachers to help build that capacity. So it's this coaching model, it's the curriculum, and it's the alignment to the standards. I think that's made a difference. And we have an ongoing data analysis system that we use all the time, looking at student group data to segregate which kids are getting it, which kids are not. And we have what we call what I need time, response to intervention time built in, and those structures are in place in our district.
All right, I'm gonna give you 30 seconds for this answer. So how are you thinking about teaching and learning for the coming year in light of COVID, and what supports do you need aside from the money, which you already talked about? Maybe the answer is just money.
The issue right now is we're probably going to have 2 models. We may have a 100% distance learning model, and we probably will have some kind of hybrid model to start the year based upon what we know right now. I think it was just talked about, helping teachers understand the best and most efficient ways to engage kids in learning in a distance learning model is what our challenge is. And we're going to have to provide ongoing professional development to support teachers in that work as we move forward.
All right, thank you so much, Jeff. Nice to talk to you. Good luck.
Nice to see you.
And I'm going to pass it back to Amy.
Thank you so much, Morgan and Jeff. That was a really interesting discussion. You both can turn off your cameras and mute yourselves. And I just want to tell everyone, thank you so much for joining today for our first session. A reminder that our breakout sessions begin at 12:30 Eastern time, which is 15 minutes from now. And you can see the 5 breakout session topics on the screen. So we've got curriculum, multilingualism, leadership and governance, professional learning, and working with standards and students with disabilities. So if you need the link to register for one of those sessions is in the chat. And then the next slide, I believe, will give us information about the closing keynote discussion between Andy Porter and Linda Darling Hammond at 1:30 today at Eastern time. And you should have received your join link for those sessions, but you can also go on our website or click the link in the side. Thank you again for coming, and we are going to leave this information on the screen, but close the session shortly. Have a great rest of your day.
Good grammar and spelling are important, but if you
Welcome to the webinar. You have entered as a panelist and may now speak to any other organizers or panelists on the line.
Good, good. Let me show you something. I want to see if this works. I think it does. Hey, Charles, Greg is getting a lot of So, Jen, do you think Andy's squared away now? I think so. Laura confirmed that she got the link.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the third and final session of our Year 5 virtual conference, CSAIL. My name is Andy Porter, and next slide. We're using live captioning, and there's how you can get it. Next, oh yeah, okay. Now, first I want to introduce our project officer, James Benson. James is at the Institute for Education Sciences, which funds the CSAIL. He's a sociologist with a degree from that great university in the Midwest, University of Wisconsin. And he is a first-rate scholar as well. In just as one indicator of that, he won the Palmer Johnson Award for Best Article in an AERA journal a couple years back. James, I'd like to hear a few words from you.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. It's been a nice introduction and also good working with you over the last 5 years. And I look forward to the next year as well. I also want to thank the CSAIL team for presenting your findings this morning and to conducting a nice set of breakout sessions. Over the last 2 years, I have reviewed findings from each of the CSAIL teams as findings have emerged from your studies. In 2 important ways, the CSAIL findings confirm expectations that IES had for the Standards in Schools Center when we wrote the request for application 6 years ago. First, college and career-ready standards, which embody complex interlacings of content standards, cognitive demand levels, and standards of practice, would be and have been difficult for districts, schools, and teachers to implement. Second, implementation has posed specific challenges for educators of students with disabilities and English learners. As I have reviewed findings from the longitudinal outcomes study team and reports and presentations from the National Center for Education Statistics on their analysis of recent data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, I have found myself profoundly discouraged by the lack of progress on a national level toward improving achievement for lower achieving students over the last 10 years. When the Common Core state standards were adopted in 2010, I, along with many others, hoped that the standards would lead to more substantial narrowing of the gaps between our highest and lowest achieving students than had occurred during the NCLB period. It seemed reasonable to believe in progress toward this goal, given that the new standards were more rigorous than many states' standards at the time. Unfortunately, several key gaps have widened during the last 10 years, and in retrospect, the NCLB years look like a time of progress, especially in mathematics. Thus, I find myself asking a new and different set of questions for researchers and policymakers today. First, are college and career-ready standards an effective way of organizing instruction in states, districts, and schools that take them seriously over an extended period of time? And I mean by that over years, with consistent endorsement and support by states and districts. And I'm thinking about recent research that has been conducted in the Chicago public schools as well as the state of Tennessee. Number 2, have we asked too much of teachers, especially those serving in under-resourced districts, during this transition to college and career-ready standards? Have we asked them to be education researchers, curriculum developers, pedagogical wizards, and classroom managers all at the same time? And question number 3, is fiscal austerity constraining the ability of districts and schools to implement advanced curricula and to recruit and train teachers to implement them? Are educators' efforts to address educational inequality being hampered by the limitations of federal and state efforts to address the everyday needs of the K-12 student population and their families? These pressing needs often prioritize access to quality housing, healthcare, and social services over the purchase of laptop computers and internet service and the completion of homework assignments. So with that said, I will turn the mic over to Andy Porter, and I look forward to hearing from Linda Darling-Hammond.
Thank you very much, James. I feel the same with you. You've been a great project officer, and I appreciate it. So now I'm introducing our main speaker of the session, Linda Darling-Hammond. She's the Charles E. Ducommun Professor of Education Emeritus at Stanford. She recently became the president of the California State Board of Education, one of our partner states, I might notice. And she and I'm a little bit older than she is, but we've had a long time together. And as far as I can tell, and without really checking it, she's won just about every major award and honor and gotten every accolade that a person in education research can get. So that's point 1. And point 2 is that she is, in my view, one of the most influential education thinkers of all time. So it's great, Linda, to have you with us today. Linda, turn on your video, and now there she is, just as good looking as ever. And
oh, thank you.
And she's going to make some remarks, and then maybe if we have some time, we'll have some Q&A. And yeah, take it away.
Great to see you, and wonderful to be in this conversation with you. We've been in a conversation about standards-based reform for many years, and I want to make a couple of remarks about the question of, can standards-based reform work? And I'm putting that in the context of, what does it take to build a system? Because I'll argue that I think if we look historically, standards-based reforms have been meaningful when they've been part of a systemic reform. Next slide. So as you've been talking about, of course, today the U.S. has 2 achievement gaps. We have the gap between white and more affluent students in the U.S. and those students of color and those living in poverty, a growing share of our student population who are continuing to achieve at lower levels in general. And then there's the gap between the U.S. and other high-achieving nations that have made substantial gains over the last 30 or 40 years. So I think that's an important part of the question as well. What do we see happening in those systems that are making those gains? Next slide. So despite years of standards-based reform and high-stakes testing, U.S. scores have declined on the international PISA tests between 2000 and 2015. 2000 was just before NCLB came online. 2015 was when it ended. Next slide. And we've seen, kind of this ongoing gap in that and colleagues have done to sort of look at of recent reforms. But you see that the largest, I think I'm having audio challenges, and maybe I should try to dial in to be heard. Are you hearing me okay? Can somebody just pop in?
Linda, this is Nicole, your host. I think the first thing we want to try is to actually have you turn off webcam. I hate that we won't be able to see you, but we can hear you, and let's try that first. If you would just, that sounds good. And then Linda, let's keep going. If we need to have you dial in, I'll let you know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So anyway, there's a huge decline in the gap in the 70s and early 80s, and then it grew again because of a change of policies in the 1980s that eliminated many of the reforms of the war on poverty and the Great Society that were changing the context for students' lives, but also desegregating schools, engaging in school finance reforms that reduced inequalities of many kinds there. But there was no standards-based reform at that time. There was a beginning of standards-based reform in the 1990s, and we can see that some kids began to do better, but the gap did grow again, and it's been continuing in a like manner since then. Next slide. Those were the math scores. These are the reading scores. You can see the decline in the gap was even bigger in reading than in math, but the gap has reopened, and this slide doesn't show it all the way to 2019, but the gap is now 30% larger today than it was 30 years ago. Next slide. So what does this have to say about standards-based reform? And, is standards-based reform, quote unquote, not working? Next slide. I just want to go back to the theory of standards-based reform. We did have one iteration and one era in the 1990s that took hold in states across the country. We did see some gains in some states from that era. But the theory of standards-based reform, as it was put out by Mike Smith and Jennifer O'Day, can you go back a slide, Nicole? Thank you. Was that it was to set clear goals for what students would know and be able to do, develop the curriculum and assessments, align standards for educators, and then to ensure professional learning around the standards, to ensure that there were quality materials and additional investments where needed, and use evidence of progress to guide the investments. And this is the piece that I think is important in understanding what's happened since. Next slide. Many states, however, in this era have had testing focused on lower level tests, which have driven a different kind of curriculum than the one intended by the standards. There's been very uneven training for teachers, and in many states, a large number of teachers coming in with no preparation before they enter the classroom. Usually these teachers are in the schools that teach the highest need students. We've had a lot of popcorn reforms, innovations that come and go. And in many states, we have deeply inequitable funding of schools. 38 states do not spend more on the education of students with greater needs than the education of those with fewer needs. And in about half of our states, it's the reverse. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Next slide. And of course, U.S. child poverty rates of the industrialized world. Homelessness increased during the Great Recession. Poor children, food insecurity, and we're seeing, of course, another hit in that regard right now in this moment of COVID that is deepening inequalities. Next slide. But notice that in that era where I showed the tremendous gains in achievement and reduction of the gap, that the percent of children in poverty in the 1960s was cut by half in one decade. And that was the decade that really signaled the big changes in achievement. It has now crept back up to not quite the level that it was in the 1950s. Next slide. So what are the highest achieving nations doing differently? All of them do have standards-based reform. In fact, the Common Core standards were designed to emulate some of the standards in other countries that were fewer, higher, and deeper. Next slide. But we see in the highest performing nations, and I've studied those in the flat world and in empowered educators, that you get a very integrated system of teaching and learning. It's a much more systemic approach where school funding is equitable with more funding in the places that have greater needs. 21st century curriculum and assessments are tied together, so assessments and curriculum go together, not separately. Investments in quality teaching are very profound. People come into teaching. in high quality programs that are completely free to them in places like Finland and Singapore. They get mentored on a regular basis tied to the curriculum and the assessment strategy. The schools are designed for teacher learning. They have anywhere from 8 to 15 hours a week of additional time beyond what our teachers have for collaboration and learning. And then there are many, many supports for child welfare and early learning. Very few children live in poverty, and even when they do, they have much greater support for their basic needs. Next slide. So some states achieve at those high international levels. We're used to hearing about Massachusetts, which has been ranking #1 since its big reforms in the early 1990s. Connecticut was one that followed on its heels. New Jersey is a surprise, and I want to speak about that in particular in a moment. And those states actually have followed a trajectory of systemic reform that is much more like what we see in other countries and much less like what we see in other states that have on the surface done, quote, standards-based reform, but have not embedded it in a systemic initiative. Next slide. So the Massachusetts and Connecticut reforms that were tied to their student standards, their new student standards in the 1990s, both of them used high-quality, open-ended assessments that really got at the deeper elements of the standards. They both had major equalization and increase in funding, preschool, child health investments, standards for educator preparation went way up, big investments in teacher salaries so they could recruit people who could meet the standards, and professional learning, and did that for more than 15 years. Next slide. North Carolina was another one in the 1990s that was 48th in the nation in math, and you can see there the green line on this slide. In 1990, tremendous investments over the course of the 1990s with their standards-based reform. By 2000, they were above the national average in math, which the largest gains in achievement and the largest decrease in the achievement gap of any state in the nation in the 1990s. They've stayed above the national average until they started to seriously cut their budgets in 2011, 2012, 2013. And I'll note that part of the tracking of these questions of standards-based reform is that in 2008, of course, we had a huge recession. In 2010, that hit the schools because the ARRA Act had run out, and we had tremendous declines in funding that hit the highest need districts the most. Next slide. So in North Carolina, which had these huge gains, we saw a very comparable set of reforms to the ones I just described, which also included emphasizing things like national board certification, 12% increase in salaries for those folks, and a huge influx of very, very well-prepared teachers who then became coaches around the standards. The assessments were chosen to emulate NAEP-like testing. So those decisions were thoughtful about the standards, and then they invested in all of the surround that allowed the standards to be relevant. Next slide. I did a study around that time which looked at the factors explaining achievement on the NAEP and found that the strongest predictor was the percentage of teachers with full certification and a major in their field, so the teacher quality dimensions. The biggest negative impact was the percent of newly hired uncertified teachers, and that's an issue in many, many states. Per pupil spending mattered, but as many other studies have found out, it was the equalization of funding so that students in high need communities got more money that made the biggest difference. Next slide. New Jersey, I wanted to mention, it is a very surprising thing to see it having climbed so much in the achievement rankings. It is a majority minority state with a high proportion of low-income students and special education students. Next slide. And during the later part of the 1990s, when their reforms went into place, they began to climb and close the achievement gap. In their first decade of reform, they did find that they got to the point where Black and Latino kids in New Jersey outscored the average kid in California, which was meanwhile disinvesting in its schools. Next slide. Those achievement trends continued, and you can see the gains. This is in mathematics. You can also see the Chris Christie dip that happened after 2013 as funding was reduced in the schools and some of the reforms were undone. but those have been put back in place. Next slide. And now New Jersey is, first in the country in 8th grade writing, second in 8th grade reading and math, second in graduation rate. And the way in which they implemented their standards, which were in a context, again, of very thoughtful, rich assessments and investments in teacher quality and learning, allowed them to overcome what a lot of states would argue is, a huge impediment to their forward momentum on achievement. Next slide. So again, the same kind of agenda that we saw in other states occurred there, along with whole school reform models. I just want to note that New York spends the same amount of money. It ranks about at the average of all states rather than near the top. But the policy mix is very, very different. They've never equalized funding. Curriculum and assessments have been a hot mess. They've started and stopped a whole number of tests. They had a very difficult unfolding of the Common Core state standards. They did not make the investments initially in teacher and leader learning. They put high stakes before they put learning opportunities. They've had a very difficult time, getting a child safety net put in place. So the policies that accompany the standards-based reforms make a big difference. Next slide. So when standards-based reform becomes systemic, you can see these sets of strategies around not only the way in which the curriculum is brought online, the standards are brought online, the assessment system is enabled to match, which is not true in too many states. The investments in teacher quality and learning are made, and in adequacy for funding, you see these very different outcomes. Next slide. So a system that is systematic actually has all of the system components working in mutually reinforcing ways. You can see this in a lot of other countries. The policies and programs affect all of the schools and teachers, not just a little bit of a pilot here and a little bit of a thing over there. And some schools that are, able to manage it do well, and other schools are left to languish, but they really have a complete systemic approach with the training and the funding that are needed to engage the implementation. Next slide. When California implemented Common Core state standards, and I will say we are still very much involved in that, and our state is very committed to the standards. This was my predecessor on the state board's sort of slide for what we had to do to align policy, looking for policy gaps, conflicts around curriculum, principal and teacher investments and policy, college readiness. We have standards that were written for English learners along with non-native English speakers. Special education accountability systems were redefined, and school funding also was put in place that was much more equitable. And we have seen California go from 48th and 49th in the country, respectively, in 8th grade reading and math, to almost all the way to the national average in reading in just about 5 years of implementing this set of reforms, and closing about half the gap to the national average in math. So it's not a top of the country story, but it is a story of some success in implementing the standards in a coherent way. Next slide. So if we wanted to get to what the anatomy of equity and achievement is, it would really include these systemic elements of supports for children, equitable school resources, investments in well-prepared and well-supported educators. The 21st century curriculum assessment then sits on top of all of those other elements to produce the kind of innovative and effective schools we're looking for. And that's the last slide.
Thank you very much. That was very useful and interesting. It sounded to me kind of like an endorsement of standards-based reform as it was originally thought about some 30 years ago. That's about when that O'Day and Smith article came out, and they were all wrapped up together. They were tied together because the standards were the goal, the lead of the systemic reform, and then everything came in. And then you say, well, it still makes sense to me. But I say work, but with a lot of variability, and this variability you pointed out as well. So it brings me to the question. Why does it work? Are some people just not faithful to it and not trying hard, or what's the deal? Why does it work sometimes and not others? And then just to salt it a little bit, you used that dirty word money quite a few times, and I myself like money, and so I can understand that. But we just experiencing this pandemic, and I think our country's going to be busted here. I mean, we're spending money in a wise way. Well, when it works, when they get the money out to the people who need it. But we're in a heck of a hole here. So if money's the key, what's going on? And then the third thing is this. I think more people in the United States today understand the importance of and love education and teachers in our schools because they're stuck with their kids. And so I think now's the time to hit them up. So what do you got to say to all that?
Yeah, well, I do think that money is part of it. And one of the things I showed you the trajectory we were on in the 70s and, into the beginning of the 80s, and the gap closed by half in that period of time. And then, it reopened. And the policies that have been behind that, some of them were money, some were, they all come back to money in some way probably. But, there was investments in more equitable spending. There was, the war on poverty, all that. The discourse in the 1980s became money doesn't matter. That was a very deliberate discourse that was created in the 1980s to say we don't have to worry about all these inequalities. We are the most unequal system in the industrialized world in terms of how we underwrite schools. And we do that in most states, except for the places like Massachusetts and some of the others that I pointed out. New Jersey, Massachusetts, now California are now spending money equitably. But if you starve the schools that serve the kids with the greatest needs, and they get a continual cycle of teachers who are untrained and don't stay very long, and if they get professional development, it walks out the door with them, and they've got other needs that need to be attended to so that they can be ready to learn without anxiety and hunger and so on. You got to make those investments. When we've made those investments and other countries make those investments routinely, we see much better learning outcomes. And it just isn't true that money doesn't matter. Rucker Johnson and Carabo Jackson have done a series of studies showing how over the period of time when school finance reforms were coming in place, the places that put as much as even 20% more into the education of low-income kids over the 12 years of their schooling had graduation rates 20 plus percentage points higher, greater educational attainment, elimination of the adult poverty gap that we would otherwise see. So yes, money does matter. And a lot of places have said, well, it's just the standards. It's just having these great standards and curriculum and assessments. And tests don't teach children. Teachers do, and teachers have to be educated, enabled, supported. They've got to make a living wage if you want them to stay in the profession, all of those things. Yes. So now what about the hole we're in now? Well, we've had multi-trillions of dollars in recovery acts coming from the federal government. Out of all those many trillions of dollars, thus far, the amount spent on education, $30 billion. So way, 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 way under 1%. We have not made the commitment to stabilize schools, to enable them to continue the work that they're doing. The money is there, and this is the question that we're going to have in the coming year and years ahead for the United States. Are we going to allocate the money in a way that will actually help our economy in a variety of ways that people, I think, aren't anticipating right now in terms of investments in education, and just allowing parents, as you said, to get back to work and to not have to be taking care of their kids. Right. So we're going to see whether those investments are made. If they are not made at the federal level right now, given the extent of this pandemic, I think we are looking at the fall of Rome. I think we're looking at the beginning of the end for the United States being a world-class country in terms of the way in which kids, in terms of the education is supported and the way in which kids are supported. We can't starve the kids and system in the highest need places indefinitely. And the reason I gave those success stories, and they continue to be, is these are places that are investing a lot more. You know, Massachusetts, Vermont is often at the top as well, New Jersey, Connecticut. They're spending $18,000 a kid more equitably than they used to on the education of teachers and leaders who can implement the standards in good ways. And they're maintaining a level of resources now, whether and achievement. Whether they can continue without support in this moment is a big question. But the places that have been disinvesting in schools are going to fall off the cliff.
Yeah, I would just underline what you kind of talked about when you said money matters. Money matters, especially if you spend it wisely. So it's not, you know, Kansas City taught us that once a long time ago. They got a lot of money for desegregation, and they didn't spend it wisely, and they didn't get any benefits to student achievement. But I would just, we're at the end of our time here, and it's too bad because it's so much fun talking with you. I would say that standards-based reform, I think, would you agree, for some people it's very difficult to implement well?
Absolutely. It's hard to implement well, and to do it well, you've got to make those investments in people's learning. It's hard to do, but if you make the investments, I think all children can learn. I think all teachers and school leaders can learn. We do see that making the investments can make a big difference, but it is hard to do well. It's sophisticated teaching, as you have shown us over so many years. It takes pedagogical thinking and skill, and so it doesn't happen without variable investments in the learning process for the adults as well.
Well, Linda, thank you very much for your thoughts and your wisdom. We are at the end of our time. Thank you, attendees, participation here, and I have one slide to show you before we go off, and that is that all of this has been recorded and will be on our website, ccl.org/videos. And if you have any questions about today's events, here's an email that you can contact. And also, remember, you could send in questions as a part of this conference format. And if you haven't done so already, I encourage you to do it. So thank you again, Linda. Thank you, James. And thank you, Jackie Kerstetter and Nicole for setting this up. And I wish you all a good rest of the day.
Great to see you. Thank you.